It is very likely that the fastest growing religion in the world is Islam. And if most people understood the full implications of that statement, they would be very disturbed. What you're about to hear and the videos you're going to see will tell you the real truth about what's really happening in Islam. And folks, hold on to the seat of your pants, because what you learn is going to be eye-opening. All right, everybody, I got to tell you, you are in for another treat. I am interviewing a dear brother. His name is Anthony Rogers, and I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about himself. And we are going to talk about a lot of issues related to Islam. And I want to say this right off the bat. There's a lot of things that are untrue that are being said about it that I want to touch base on. We're going to get involved in having that conversation. But before we do that, I want you to get to know Anthony a little bit. So, Anthony, welcome. We're glad you're here, bro. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you. So I was born and raised in Southern California. And at the time growing up there were a lot of gangs. Not that there aren't now, but I'm a little bit out of touch with the current situation over there since I now live on the East Coast. But back in those days, there were gangs surging throughout Southern California. And in my teen years, I fell in with gang activity, gang individuals. And eventually that led my family to move us to Las Vegas to sort of remove me from that context. Unfortunately, my parents didn't have a biblical view of the fall and human nature, and they mistakenly thought that removing me from the environment would rectify the problem, but it didn't deal with the sin in my heart. So I got in trouble there when I was 18. In 1993, I went to prison, and that's where I heard the gospel. And I was so overjoyed hearing about the forgiveness of sins through Christ that I immediately started telling others about him, assuming they would jump at this good news. They would.
In prison?
Yeah, I was in prison.
Wow. Okay, that's amazing. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry, go
So
ahead.
so I assumed, because to me this was good news. It really was gospel. I heard about the free forgiveness of sins on account of Christ enduring in my place the judgment of God. And I thought, this is incredible. I have to tell everybody about this. I started trying to do that in the prison. And remember, the people that were there for, they weren't there for their good conduct. And so I quickly found out that not everyone was happy to hear this. And I got a good bit of backlash. And in prison, there was a sizable number of Muslims. Islam appeals to certain factions within prison. It gives them an opportunity to placate their conscience by pretending to be religious, and at the same time maintain the same kind of behavior that they were engaging in before. Here's a religion that tells you that you can be violent towards others, and also tells you that you're doing this and you're right with God in doing so. So that was my context. That's where my interest in Islam was born. I started reading Islamic literature just like I was reading the Bible. And from there, it just became what it is now. I continue to write, to engage Muslims, to debate Muslims, and, go to mosques and that sort of thing.
Man, it's awesome. And I have to tell you this because one of the passages in the Quran that struck me, and I know that a lot of people oftentimes don't like reading this passage because it opens up a door for a conversation that a lot of Christians are not necessarily prepared to have. But this is in the Quran. My audience knows this passage because I quote it all the time, and then I oftentimes translate it, and I'll read it to you. It says this. It says, "Wa makru wa makra Allahu wa Allahu khayra al makrina," and you know the passage right away when I
Yeah,
say it.
that's
And
the deceivers.
yes, that Allah is the chief of deceivers. Basically, it's amazing because deception is a big part of Islam. A massive part of Islam. As a matter of fact, it's unique to me in that Islam, in my opinion, is probably the epitome of a lack of critical thinking. there is in many ways a lot of assertions that get made that are based on the piggybacks of what is founded in some truth and then twisted to kind of create a different type of thought or a different type of idea. And there's a lot of statements that are being made right now, especially as Islam is becoming more and more mainstream by people like Muhammad Hijab, for example, or now Andrew Tate and some of these other characters that are really beginning to push this narrative. But in many ways, these narratives are founded in a series of lies. And now this has become front and center because of what's happened with Israel and everything that's happening with Hamas. And what's scary about the Hamas Israel thing is that a lot of people think that it is just simply an issue that is mutually exclusive to Israel, and it has no real issue or bearing on the United States of America or anybody else. And it is still mind boggling to me how benevolent so many people are to the cause of Islam in supporting Hamas in a time like this. So much of it doesn't make sense. So, how about we start on this? Where are some of the biggest lies that you see communicated in Islam? And maybe we can have a conversation about violence and is it mutually exclusive to Israel or is it coming our way?
Yeah, well, I mean, biggest lies. That's that's just really to me that's asking me to tell you everything I know about Islam because
Oh, yeah, I
really
think you're
the
right. Yeah.
the religion is chock full of it. It's representation of Christianity, its representation of itself. Everything I look at every turn on every hand involves some kind of lie or deception. And so, for example, just to pick a doctrine that the Quran addresses often that it just never gets right is the doctrine of the Trinity. It never accurately represents the doctrine of the Trinity. It mentions that it's a belief in three gods, for example, and then it identifies the other two who are members of this three god confederacy as Jesus and Mary. And then it
Mm.
seeks to refute that by pointing out that both of them used to eat food. And so this is a colossal lie. And trying to talk to a Muslim about the triune God is almost impossible, not because you can't show it to them in the Bible, not because you can't accurately define it, but because they can't even accept your definition, even prior to the defense that you might give of it. They can't even accept your definition without already acknowledging that their religion is false, that their book has lied to them. And so you can't even get past the definitional stage with that sort of thing. But then even when they talk about their deity, they pretend that Islam is a belief in pure monotheism, but when you start inquiring into it or listening longer to them talk about their religion, it quickly becomes apparent that they don't believe in pure monotheism. And so, just as one example, Muslims will say that the Quran being Allah's speech, so one of his attributes, it's necessarily eternal. They don't think of it as inspired. When Muhammad wrote it, he wasn't writing by being moved along by the Holy Spirit, as was the case with the apostles, but rather, he was hearing dictated to him by an angel what was already inscribed from all eternity in a book with Allah. This is his eternal speech. And so, if you ask a Muslim, is the Quran eternal? They'll say yes, because it's Allah's speech. If you ask them, is the Quran Allah? They'll say no, because how could this book be his speech? There you have at least two eternals. When you look further into Islam and ask, then, if this is the case with one of his attributes, his speech, what about all his other attributes? According to the Quran, he has 99 names and the Hadith. And really, these are just 99 that we know about. There's really more. And each of them represent an attribute that represents an independently existing eternal reality in addition to Allah's essence. Now, I know this is a little deep in
Wow.
the weeds here for some people, but I'm just pointing out these are classic points that are brought up by Muslims. They'll say the Trinity is this, and we're pure monotheists, but it's a lie all across the board. We don't believe in three gods, and they don't believe in a God who's absolutely one. He's actually a being that has a multiplicity of independently existing attributes that virtually have a life of their own. So I like to point that out to people because if you talk to a Muslim, these are issues that are going to come up, and you just shouldn't be snowed by their insistence that they're absolute monotheists and they're insistent that you're not.
Well, this is one of the points that guys like Andrew Tate continue to make. And that is the fact that Christians are not consistent. They don't stand for their beliefs. To his credit, I will just say that he does observe a lot of pastors that have given themselves to the woke industrial complex and have flexed in a lot of areas, but he doesn't look at the true teachings of the Bible or necessarily understand them, which is why he makes the case that he makes. And to a degree, he represents what a lot of the mainstream thought process is. So I'm not going to beat him up over that. I just think that it's interesting to see the inconsistencies that exist in making assertions like that. When in reality, when you look at the tenets of Islam, and so much of it is, look, you could be a pantheist, in my opinion, and probably worship less gods than you do when you're in the center of Islam. And it's such a great point that you're making. Let me ask you this question because we're in a very serious place, okay? And one of the things that I hear a lot as we're talking about Hamas and we're talking about what's going on right now in Israel and so much is that these are extremists and this is not Islam and this is not what we believe and this is not our thought and so on and so forth. When in reality, my assertion is they're doing exactly what they're asked to do. Me and you are biblical fundamentalists. We believe in the fundamentals of the Bible. I believe that these people are fundamentalists in Islam. They believe in the fundamentals of the Quran. This is their assertion. This is how they carry themselves. Can we talk about this a little bit? Because this is very not understood by a lot of people because it's unknown. I mean, there's not a lot of discussion about this stuff. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I told you I started studying Islam. I was reading the Quran. I was reading whatever Islamic literature I could get my hands on when I was first converted because I was surrounded by Muslims. I didn't really focus much on the jihad aspect of the religion because it was in a sense a moot point in my context. I'm in a prison. These guys could be violent, but it just wasn't, it wasn't a war, it wasn't a national type thing. But it was all there. I knew it. I was reading it, and it was surprising to me on 9/11. Now, this is many years after I had encountered Muslims and was reading their sources. 9/11 happened, and I remember my surprise at the time was, gosh, I'm surprised that something like this hadn't happened earlier in my lifetime. I know there were things that were happening around the world and things that had happened before my time, but I just remember thinking everything I read in the Quran, I was kind of surprised this was the first time that it became a big issue for people. But then I'm looking and I'm seeing that they're all surprised that Islam is being represented this way, as if this is representative of Islam. So there was a lot of craziness in my mind when I saw. But one of the first things I did at the time was I went and picked up this book. It's by a guy named Paul Fregosi, and it's just aptly titled Jihad. And what it does is it goes through just looking at Western history and shows all the different lands that Islam engaged in aggressive warfare against, all the different lands that it tried to conquer. And it's a massive book. And even at that, the author doesn't say everything that could be said. But it's just remarkable. This is the idea that the people that are currently engaged in militant attempts to spread Islam are somehow hijacking the religion or have misunderstood it just goes against all of history since the time that Muhammad was here. But it also goes against the clear statements of the Quran. So, for example, this is Surah 3, 151 of the Quran. It says, "We," this is Allah speaking, "we shall cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieve because they joined others in worship with Allah." So notice at the heart of Allah's project is casting terror into the hearts of unbelievers. Then in Surah 8:12, it says, "Remember when your Lord revealed to the angels, 'Verily, I am with you, so keep firm those who have believed. I will cast terror into the hearts of those who have disbelieved, so you strike them over the necks and smite over all their fingers and toes.'" Later in the same surah, Surah 860, it says, "Against them make ready your strength to the utmost of your power to strike terror into the hearts of the enemies of Allah and your enemies." I could easily keep this up, quoting passage after passage, but here's a interesting one from Ibn Yitzhak. He was the or a biographer of Muhammad, interestingly, the earliest biographer. So if this is not a useful or reliable source of information for Muhammad, Muslims are in trouble because they need this kind of stuff to argue in any way for the evidential, nature of their religion. But Ibn Yitzhak says that Muhammad once said, "Will you listen to me, O Quraysh? By him who holds my life in his hands, I have come to bring you slaughter." And then later in a hadith narrated by Abu Huraira. So a hadith, for those that don't know, is a tradition allegedly from Muhammad, and there are different traditions. Some they'll say aren't really from Muhammad, but this is a reliable tradition by their own standards. Abu Huraira reported that Muhammad, Allah's messenger, said, "Now listen to this. I have been sent with the shortest expressions bearing the widest meanings, and I have been made victorious with terror. While I was sleeping, the keys of the treasures of the world were brought to me and put in my hand." So
Hmm.
notice this. This is the Muhammad who claims that his God is all about instilling terror into the hearts of non Muslims, who tells his people to enforce this, to follow up this act of putting terror in their hearts with acts of terror, smiting them on their necks and smiting off their hands and toes. Here, Muhammad says this God, this same God, came to him at night and offered him the treasures of the world. That ought to sound familiar to people. Here you have a individual who comes to bring slaughter, comes to bring terror. He comes to kill and destroy, and he says that the kingdoms or treasures of the world were offered to him. I think that speaks plain as day to Christians as to the true nature of this religion, its agenda, and so forth.
I think that that is so heavy. And I think that it lends for a lot of other questions to come up, right? Because when you look at this and you begin to realize the things that you're seeing, right, where it's the what I like to call them homicide bombers, and all the other things that are happening, they are just simply holding fast to the things that have been instructed to them, and it's something that we see very clearly. Can you do me this favor? Insert for me a little bit of understanding with what motivates Hamas to do what they're doing, for example, in Israel. There's a lot we can get into, right? I mean, obviously, we've educated our audience on a lot. We understand the geopolitics of this area. We try to tell people about the fundamentals that exist with Iran sponsoring Hamas and the complexities of that, being that Iran is a Shiite predominantly Shiite nation where Hamas is Sunni, but they're coming together, which is very ironic, by the way, very unusual, but they're doing it for a very common purpose. Um, the complexities of Hezbollah to the north and the Houthis in Yemen. We've talked about all of that stuff with our audience, but there's a growing sentiment that we see being spoken of in colleges around the country, being spoken of by people in mainstream discussions. Pierce Morgan's done a bunch of interviews with different people who have made all kinds of wild assertions about what's going on. They are no longer being referred to as terrorists, they're being referred to as freedom fighters. And the characterization of their actions centers dominantly around the idea that these are people that are fighting for a better life. They want a better life. They want a nice home. They want to, raise their children normally, and you know, all of these different things. Yet there seems to be a real contradiction in what we're seeing, because you're seeing all these innocent lives that are being affected, not necessarily at the hands of Israel. Um, can we talk about this? Like, what motivates people like Hamas as it relates to Islam? Because I think that's the big thing. Because look, when they're doing the things that they're doing, we're not hearing things like, "Yeah, we got him." We're hearing Allahu Akbar. Those are the types of things that we're hearing. And there's a lot of those types of statements being made that are quoting the Quran, giving glory to Allah, all of those things. So can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So there's a lot that could come to the fore here. One thing I would say is, given Islam's view of salvation, which is markedly different from ours, we think that we are saved through the doing and dying of Christ. It's foolishness to the world. To Jews who don't believe that, it strikes them as problematic because they expect feats of power. And to the ancient Greek who prized philosophy, they expected some sort of uh, rhetorical flourish, some sort of discourse on metaphysical matters, wisdom, philosophy, that sort of thing. The idea of a Jewish man dying on a cross as the way of salvation just strikes both parties as foolish. And Islam is nothing if not a religion of power. It seems to think that, for example, the forgiveness of sins, Allah could just will it. They often say, if Allah is almighty, he can just forgive sins. Why do we need Christ on the cross? Not realizing that they're dispensing with God's justice. God is fundamentally just and has to punish sin in order for his wrath to be averted. And so in their mind, power is the mark of truth, and they show the truth of their religion by being dominant. And so whenever any other group has any kind of claim, even if they're not running around boasting about it, but if there's any semblance of credibility behind or any ability to claim that they are prevailing over Muslims physically, militarily, in any way, it to them is a disproof of their religion, and it's embarrassing to them. In fact, one of the things you hear Muslims saying a lot, they'll say things like, "I'm proud to be a Muslim." Now, as a Christian, if somebody asked me, "Are you proud to be a Christian?" I if I heard that, I'd think, well, yeah, I'm not embarrassed to be a Christian, obviously,
Right.
but that's just not the way I would normally think to express it. I would say
Right.
I'm overjoyed to be in Christ.
Yeah,
I
grateful. Yeah.
delight to be in Christ, but just the word proud just isn't the word that comes to mind, but it does to Muslims because this is how they think. And so their religion has to show itself to be dominant. That's illustrated in even their architecture. If they're in control in a land, they want their buildings to be higher than Christian buildings. They don't want a building with a steeple to rise higher than a mosque with one of their minarets or whatever going into the sky. This is why there's a great interest, if you look over in Saudi Arabia, for really tall buildings. They want to have taller buildings. It's all symbolic to them. So they think in terms of power, they think in terms of physical might. And so for Israel to even exist when that land at one point had been conquered by Muslims is for them to have a black eye, which is embarrassing to them. Just the very existence of Israel over there, it shows that they were pushed back to some degree in their onward march. But I also think that there's more to it than just that. There's the fact that I think the very existence of Israel is a reminder to evil forces that God has a purpose in the world and has been working towards that purpose. And Christ is the high point of it, but not there's more that's being done. And I just, it's sort of like if you think of Revelation 12, where it talks about the woman conceiving, giving birth to a child. Satan goes after the child is caught up to the throne, and then the dragon goes after the woman's seed. The Lord Jesus had to have left a sour taste in his mouth for the Jews. And so, Islam, one of the things when I talk about Islam, I like the statement of Martin Luther. He referred to Islam as God's rod and the devil's servant. And what he's doing is he was reflecting on Old Testament passages where it talks about how certain nations were used by God, even if they had different purposes. But think, for example, of Assyria in Isaiah
Oh, yeah.
10, where Assyria is called the rod of God's rod, right? The rod of his anger. But it says, "Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger," meaning that Assyria, on the one hand, was going to be used by God to chastise his people for their idolatry, but on the other hand, they were going to be judged and punished. That's why it says, "Woe to Assyria," because their intention was not to chastise his people so that they would come to their senses. It was so that they could just lay them waste. They were enemies of God's people, and that was their intention. That was their design. So I look at Islam as similar. I think God has used Islam to chastise not just Israel, but I think it's been used to chastise even wayward groups that would claim to be Christians. The Christians of the Middle East in certain areas were given over to idolatry and icons. And Islam is nothing if not implacably anti idols. And
Yeah.
so, I believe the Lord has used Islam in spite of itself. It doesn't intend to be used for good purposes, but it has been used by God to be a rod of correction. But none of that removes the fact that in its heart, Islam has evil purposes that are there because they're animated ultimately by their father, which is not God, but Satan.
Yeah, and boy, this is so true. We saw this with Babylon in Daniel. We saw this, of course, with the northern kingdom of Israel. That's what Assyria did to the northern kingdom. It's interesting to see what happened. It all culminated in 586 BC on the 9th of Av when Nebuchadnezzar came in and destroyed the southern kingdom of Judah, and the amount of lives that were lost in Jerusalem alone. And God had actually referred to Babylon as his servant. And as a matter of fact, it's interesting to see Habakkuk lose his mind and say, "Hey, come on, we're your people, and you're calling these people your servants. What does that mean?" And of course, God responds to him and pretty much says, "Mind your own business. The just live by faith. Trust me, and understand." And I think you're absolutely right. I think that God has been using so many of these people to execute his judgment. I think that what's happening in the United States of America is undoubtedly a function of God's judgment. And I think that, a lot of people talk about, how the current president became the president and, election this and all the other things that they talk about. And I'm not discounting or minimizing any of those statements. But the one thing I am saying is, and I can say this with confidence, I can say that Joe Biden is a form of judgment upon the United States of America and what his regime is doing. We had a tremendous, insatiable appetite for sin, and God says, "You want sin? You can have it. Here you go. This is what you get." And in doing so, we're bringing it upon ourselves. We're bringing destruction upon ourselves, and that's what we're experiencing right now. And I do agree with you. I do think that Islam is undoubtedly a big part of this hand of judgment that we're allowing to be a part of. It doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it just. It makes they're about as evil gets. Perhaps maybe one of the most evil influences in the world today. But undoubtedly, I think you're 100% right on this one.
Yeah, I mean, Isaiah tells us it's judgment when God has children ruling over his people, for example, right?
Yeah,
The leaders we have are a reflection of our spiritual condition and of God's response to it. It's remarkable that it's been this long before we got something like this, and it's remarkable that we're not further along the route to judgment than we are.
I think it's completely right. And it's funny, we think of Isaiah 9 and even Isaiah 7, but you look at Isaiah 9 and you hear the whole "unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given." It's a very commonly quoted passage. You see it on Thomas Kincaid cards and so on and so forth, but they don't look at the context. You look at the context, you look at the end
Mm.
of chapter 8 of Isaiah, he's talking about the northern kingdom going dark. And when you think of Zebulun and Naphtali, which are the two tribes that were being judged at that moment in the northern kingdom by Assyria specifically. It's amazing how it's getting darker and darker and darker. And yet, in that darkness and in the execution of God's judgment through the Assyrians, which, by the way, were in essence the modern day inventors of, or they modern day terrorism comes from the Assyrians, probably Tiglath-Pileser, if we were to trace it down to him. And the influence that Islam has in that is they're very connected. But what's interesting is he brings us out. He refers to Christ as the Prince of Peace, right? Understanding the fact that in the time of the greatest darkness, when the world has gone dark, Christ comes into the world to fix it. Very, very interesting, by the way, when you look at where Christ was born. Bethlehem happens to be in the area of Naphtali, of Zebulun and Naphtali, where those tribes were situated at that point. So I think that's a very well placed discussion. I haven't really heard that talked about with respect to Islam and God's judgment. I think it's a very, very well placed discussion there. Can we talk about the timing of Islam a little bit? A lot of people speak about it being very original and it's been around a long time. And I'm beginning to hear something now that I have never heard before. I have never heard this before, and maybe you've heard it, but people are beginning to say that Islam is the longest standing religion in world history. And I have never heard that before. And I'm beginning to hear people say that. I cannot believe I'm hearing that. Can you talk about that for just a second?
Yeah, so part of what's going on is they're playing a game with the word Islam and Muslim. So Islam and Muslim, as you know better than I do, those are two words in Arabic that are related.
Yep.
They have the same trilateral root, right?
Yes.
The word Islam means submission, and a Muslim is one who submits.
Yep.
And so, for a Muslim, if they look in the Quran, it'll say things like Jesus was a Muslim, or Moses or Abraham, they were all Muslims. Now, if all you mean by that is the prophets submitted to God, well then who could deny that? No Christian would. We absolutely think that they submitted. But that's not what the word means post Muhammad. From
Yeah.
the time of Muhammad on, this means something entirely other than that. It refers to a religion that has Muhammad as its chief prophet, and his teachings and his morality and all the rest. It's a package deal. If you asked, did Abraham believe that sort of stuff? No. Did Moses believe that? No. But other things that they'll do is they'll point to certain practices that would have characterized people of the past that don't necessarily characterize Christians today. So, for example, you can find in the Bible that when people prayed, they would prostrate. And so Muslims will say, we prostrate, they prostrate. See, it's the same religion. This is all fallacious to the core. Part of the problem is, well, one, prostration in the Bible doesn't refer to the same act that they're engaged in. They
That's right.
engage in a series of what they call rachas and other things that where they're kneeling down and putting their forehead on the ground and so forth. But when a person prostrated in the Bible, they were actually laying flat on the ground,
Yeah.
literally prostrated all across the ground, showing their humility before God. But that's not the only way they prayed. Sometimes they prayed looking up to heaven. Christians today typically have their eyes closed with their heads bowed, but often you see people praying with their eyes cast towards heaven. Uh, so there's a fluidity with respect to a lot of this. But basically, what I'm pointing out is Muslims are misled by certain terms like Muslim and Islam that are susceptible of being used in different ways, and then they conflate the meanings and pretend that they mean the same thing all across the board, and they just don't. But another thing is, you do get in the Quran, you get the statements like Abraham was in Mecca, Abraham built the Kaaba. You get statements that Adam originally built the Kaaba before it was destroyed and then rebuilt by Abraham and his son Ishmael. So you get these kinds of things in their sources, and that's just part of the misunderstanding of Muhammad, thinking that he's actually another prophet in the line of prophets, that he's not bringing something fundamentally discontinuous. And that was something he could say at the time because people didn't have access to the scriptures in their own language. And so Muhammad could make these claims, and some, especially his kinsmen, couldn't just open the Bible and see if they were true or not. But he's making these claims that he is bringing the same religion that Adam was sent with, that Abraham was sent with, that Moses was sent with. And that just means that he's the last and greatest, not that he's the first of this religion. And so, it's not true. That's why Muslims will today have to say that the Bible's been corrupted. As
Yeah.
long as the Bible was not accessible to the people at the time of Muhammad in their language, he could make that claim. But as soon as Islam began to spread beyond the borders of Arabia, then they were encountering Christians who had the Bible in their own languages. And at that point, Christians could say, no, that's not true. Jews could say, no, that's not true. And then Muslims had to say, well, the Bible then has been corrupted. But Muhammad never made that claim in the Quran. The earliest Muslim viewpoint on these things was that the Bible was the word of God. It hadn't been corrupted. God's word can't be corrupted. Therefore, it's inviolable, it's authoritative, and anybody who doesn't abide by it is under Allah's wrath.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we don't even see copies of the Quran surface until what, 300 years after Muhammad died? I mean, maybe even longer. I don't know. I have to go back and look at the timing on that. But what's interesting to me is that if you take it a step further, Muslims are not even allowed to believe the direct words of any of the prophets in the Bible, including Moses or anybody else. They're told that the only person that can correctly interpret the words of those prophets is Muhammad. So they're not even allowed to believe in the prophets, even though they pride themselves in believing the prophets, which is unique and ironic in the first place.
Yeah, they often use as their main selling point that they're pure monotheists. They believe in absolutely one God. And I like to tell them that they're actually monoprophetic. They only have one prophet. When they talk to you, they always want to say, ours is the religion of all the prophets. Muhammad brought the same message they all brought. And I say, what's the proof of that? And all they can do is point to Muhammad. And so when they say, for example, that Abraham taught what Muhammad taught, all that means is Muhammad said that Abraham taught what he taught. When they say Moses taught something, all that means is Moses, according to Muhammad, said what Muhammad said, right? That's all it amounts to when they say, and to them, it does sort of, I can almost see them in the act of saying this, engaging in intrapersonal deception. In other words, it's not just that they're trying to deceive others, but it's even when they're talking, it's like they're addressing themselves and persuading themselves that something is true that doesn't make any
Mm.
sense. They're saying that theirs is a religion of all the prophets, but they don't have any prophets to consult in order to confirm or disconfirm this. All they've got are the words of Muhammad saying that these were the teachings of people before him. And so, again, it's just monoprophetic. There's not a long line of prophets testifying to these things that Muhammad then comes along and confirms. It's rather just one man speaking on their behalf. The terminology people use today is Allah is Muhammad's sock puppet, right?
Hmm.
He's created a sock puppet account and he's using it to speak for him.
I want to play a video for you. I'm going to actually play a few videos for you, maybe to react to this guy here. Which, by the way, let me just say this: this is actually pretty well translated. Okay, the translation, because I speak Arabic, and the what he says here is actually very well translated. Listen to what this guy says. He is a very influential guy in Egypt. Actually, is the former Grand Mufti in Egypt. And what he says is, it's just remarkable. And of course, the subtitles that are here are actually very, very good. I'm going to just play a portion of this, and I want you to react to this and tell me how truly viable this actually is, and if at all possible, I would love to see your reaction to this, because this is just astounding to me. Listen to what he says, and this goes back to the violence of Islam, the hatred for Jews, all of this kind of stuff. Look at what's said here. It's pretty remarkable. Here we go.
زوال الكيان الصهيوني لا نعرف ما الذي يحدث بعده. اليهود وإسرائيل والكيان الصهيوني لا يساوي عند الله وعند الناس جناح بعوضة. تخيل معي تخيل سياسي أن إسرائيل زالت، فما الذي سيكون؟ تدخل أمريكا فوراً. إياك أنت فاكر إن إسرائيل دي لما هنرميها في البحر خلاص خلصت الحكاية. تدخل أمريكا فوراً. وفي الحديث إنكم تقاتلون الروم اللي هم الأمريكان دول. طب وإذا دخلت أمريكا خلاص إسرائيل خلصت، هيحصل إيه؟ تدخل روسيا فورا. وروسيا دول اللي هم مين؟ اللي هم يأجوج ومأجوج، قبائل في أرمينيا موجودة ومعروفة وعارفينها وكل حاجة معروفة وموجودة مكتوبة. فتخيل أن أن الأمريكان والروس دخلوا لك هنا، هتعمل إيه؟ هتقاتلهم أرضك. بلدي. ولذلك فهذا أمر يحتاج إلى تدخل إلهي مباشر. فأنبأنا النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أن التدخل سيحدث، وأن عيسى ابن مريم سينزل فيقضي على يأجوج ومأجوج دول، وينتصر المسلمون على الروم، بس بتدخل إلهي بقى.
What's interesting to me is a phrase that he says, "Wadakhu ilahi," right? In Arabic. When we use the term ilahi, this is not a term that is exclusive for Allah. As a matter of fact, there are many, many Christians, including people in my family, that see the term Allah as a misappropriated word in the Arabic Bible. It's not a word that we should be using. Allah is regarded as a name and not necessarily a title. A lot of people say it's a title. It's not. But it's interesting how he is interchanging and conflating terms. And when he says ilahi here, although we see that word being used a lot in Islam, he is very, very carefully intertwining and conflating the term ilahi with Allah. And it's interesting because even the phrase ilahi we use in Hebrew, we use it in Aramaic. Very interesting to see what they're doing here. But your reaction to this is, I just wanted to make that side note about the use of that particular term. What do you think of what you just saw?
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the things that was a little surprising to me is in the Quran. So the Quran does pick up things from the Bible. You can tell it has no idea what those things are about.
Right.
So, as an example, I read a verse earlier about the terror that Allah will instill into the hearts of unbelievers. It says, "We will instill terror." This way of speaking was picked up by Muhammad like a dog picks up fleas from Jews and Christians. He heard Jews and Christians reciting the scriptures. It was an oral culture. And God in the Bible, of course, speaks in the plural. But Allah is not triune, so why is he talking that way? And there's a whole area of study here that I'd love to talk about on that whole issue. But the fact of the matter is, when you get down to it, according to even the Islamic sources, he's picking this up from Jews and Christians. And when he was challenged on it, why are you talking this way? He didn't have a good answer. And so he just walked away silently and said only Allah knows what it means. Now, my reason for bringing that up is because this sort of thing is happening all throughout the Quran. Muhammad mentions Gog and Magog in the Quran, but the way it's mentioned there is that it refers to a group of people that are behind this great wall that they're not able to pass beyond, and nobody can pass beyond it to them until this time when the Lord, or however it happens, the way is made for them to pass beyond it. And this has led to a lot of controversy among Muslims because we're now able to see, for the most part, everything on earth. And there's just no place like that. There's no
Right.
place that corresponds to the description given in the Quran. Now, that doesn't mean the same thing is true for the Bible. The Bible doesn't put it that way, right? But that's where you get, there's a big controversy has been with, for example, Sheikh Yasser Qadi, who's an American Muslim sheikh. He has challenged the traditional understanding of that, just in light of the fact that there's just no place on earth where this could actually be found. And so other Muslims have charged him with being an unbeliever. So it's interesting to me when I listen to him talk about Russia. What's surprising is what he's saying,
Yeah.
because again, the Quran, the way it describes Gog and Magog, it's taken terms from the Bible but puts them in an entirely different context. So I don't know where he's getting the notion of Russia from, given his sources. But then it's also additionally interesting that he's it should be interesting to every Christian to hear him say that the one who's going to exercise the divine initiative in overturning all of this in the favor of the Muslims is Jesus, son of Mary,
Yeah.
right? They
Yeah.
think he is going to be their great victor at the end, and obviously, this shows that there's an awareness of the second coming of Christ, which again comes from Christian scriptures, but it repackages it, right? Jesus is coming as an Islamic prophet. He's coming to destroy the cross. He's coming to aid them in their fight against Jews and Christians. So, interesting stuff.
And purposefully, it's a very calculated terminology that he's using. If you speak Arabic, you'll understand it. Obviously, you have some familiarity with Arabic. It's very obvious. It's unique that he is speaking about Jesus, and in the same sentences, he is not using the term Allah. He's actually using Ilahi, which is a very different, because look, there's a lot of people in Islam that incorrectly say that Ilahi is part of the root of the word Allah, which is not the case. Allah is a literal name that identifies one person. It's not a title that identifies God in general. And a lot of people miss that point, and they do it because they think it's moot, it's superfluous, it doesn't matter. But it matters significantly, because if you understand it for what it is, then you immediately cut off at the helm. I mean, immediately you cut off the argument that says that, Jesus was a Muslim, or was a Muslim, or any of those types of things. It's a big deal, and it was very contradictory. And by the way, he's very respected. This guy is very respected in Egypt, in Islam, very, very respected. He's a very respected teacher. So, and the translation that they gave, the memory translation, is actually very good. It's not a bad translation. Although some people, they translate Byzantines, some people actually refer to it as Romans. Some people, when they hear that word in Arabic. But either way, it's a very good translation.
Hmm.
Here's another one that I want you to respond to, because this is slightly different, but it deals very much with a lot of the same themes that we've been talking about. Let me play this for you, and give me your reaction to this one, bro. This is another unique one. Okay, let me give you. Well, I'll just play it. I don't even have to give you context on it. This is interesting. It's obviously in the United Kingdom, but take a look at this one.
And how's the campaign to move Britain over to Sharia law coming along?
Well, this is in the hands of God. We do our best to
Going well?
propagate Islam. Well, of course it is. I think many people will see that democracy and freedom is no good for the British, no good for Afghanistan, and in fact, we need an alternative. Unlike man-made law, the Sharia is not something which gives you a right today to take it away tomorrow. It's good in all times and places.
Sir, to make this an issue of freedom and democracy is absurd. Anjum, you haven't had a hair on your body touched by this government or this country. You haven't spent a day in prison. You haven't suffered one bit for your views. You're allowed to sit here right now because of freedom and democracy in your so-called caliphate. You'd have me killed, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you have me? Am I an apostate that deserves death?
Under your caliphate, he would be executable, would he?
He will be judged by an Islamic judge, and then after that...
So he'll be judged by an Islamic judge. But the thing that's even more interesting is the inconsistency in his language. He did something that would, by those same people that would be judging in the caliphate, would hold him. They would say haram on him, because he used the term God and is not using the term Allah, it's shocking. More and more of these people that are prominent in the media are walking away from the term Allah and beginning to use the term God. It's a different issue. The major focus on this is, you'll be judged. And in essence, you're going to be executed.
Yeah, well, on the use of the term Allah, I always hate it when I go to a because as you know, the translations, I can tell when you mention that this is a very good translation of this clip or that statement, that you're aware that that's not always the case. Sometimes the Arabic is not well represented in the English, and that's true in translations. And so I've gotten used to reading a lot of different translations on the Quran, probably more than I've read on the Bible. Now, I went to seminary and I learned Hebrew and Greek, and so if I want to know what I think the precise reading should be in English of something, I'll just look at the original languages. But I'm not as proficient in Arabic. What I know is because of my interactions with them and because of some similarities to Hebrew. And so I've picked up things over the years, but I'm still in the position where I have to look at translations. And And I'm often put out by the fact that this translation might render other aspects of the verse better than this translation, but it uses the word God instead of Allah,
Yeah.
and that to me is problematic because it really should be used for their distinctive deity, and just not otherwise. The other day I heard a Muslim arguing that the name Yahweh is not the name of God, Allah is. So at least he's
Yeah.
being true to his
Yeah.
Islamic convictions here.
I'm shocked that someone would
But
that you don't hear that a lot. I'm sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
but he's trying to counter the Christian point that, hey, look, your God, your prophet don't even seem to know what God's covenant name is, the name that he revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai and said, this is his memorial name to all generations. He doesn't even seem to know that. And isn't this a problem then for his claim to be the true God, or Muhammad's claim to be the last and final and greatest prophet of that God? And so that's what this Muslim was responding to. And he said this. And now here's what was funny about it. Immediately after that, he was talking about the names of certain prophets, and he didn't even seem to notice the inconsistency. He mentioned, for example, the name of John the Baptist, which in the Quran is Yahya. In Hebrew, which it comes from, it's Yochanan. And the reason that's interesting is that's not the only biblical prophet that's mentioned in the Quran. Many are, but their names are what are known as theophoric names. They have embedded within them the name of God. So Yochanan is a theophoric name. It means Yahweh is or has been gracious, right? Or if it mentions Elijah, Eliyahu in Hebrew, Yah, there's a contracted form of the divine name. But the point being that Muhammad surreptitiously picks these terms up, doesn't realize that they are pointers to the name of God, and it's not the name of his God. It's not the name of the God that he's talking about. So I like to think of these sorts of things in the Quran as things that the Lord providentially, left there in a sense, so that people could, have some test. It's sort of like when Paul said to the pagans that God hasn't left himself without a witness. Even in the midst of their idolatry, God has shown evidence of his existence, his goodness, and of the sinfulness of their idolatrous ways. He's left evidence of himself, and by that means is leaving the door open for them to return to him in repentance and faith. And so even in the Quran, you've got these little signposts saying, hey, you're looking in the wrong book. This is not the true God. But uh, back to old Anjum, I recognized him immediately, by the way, Anjum Chowdhury.
Mm.
It's interesting, in the clip they said, you haven't been incarcerated or anything. And what they're talking about, I'm assuming in context, is just for being a Muslim or something like that.
Right, yes.
But the fact is, Anjum Chowdhury was eventually incarcerated because of acts of violence and promoting terrorism.
That's
He,
right.
he actually did inspire atrocious acts. There were various people. I remember there was one time a guy inspired by Anjum Chowdhury they showed pictures of this guy. He had like machetes in the street that were bloody from hacking people. He was eventually incarcerated because of his violent ways, being true to his religion. So, yeah, very, very interesting clip. That had to be before he was incarcerated. But
Yeah, my guess was this was 3 years ago
hmm.
is my guess. So I don't know when he was actually incarcerated, but I do know that he has been in a lot of trouble over the years for some of the things that he's incited. He's very known for this, and a highly controversial figure by many, but very praised by a lot of people in Islam, especially in the UK, and a lot of the things that are going on over there. It's a remarkable thing. Um, Bro, I just have to tell you how absolutely grateful I am for the time you've given us, man. What a total blessing. We're coming up on that 1 hour mark, and I wanted to just give you a final opportunity to maybe share some final thoughts on all of this. And then when we're done with that, I'd like you to tell people how they can get a hold of your material, how they can go and support you. If you have a YouTube channel, website, all of that, we'd like to point people your way to get resources. So let's do it.
Yeah, so I started off mentioning that Muhammad, in a authentic hadith, according to Islamic standards, said that he was shown a vision of all the treasures of the world and them being offered to him in the service of this God and this religion. And we know from all that we've talked about and just looking past, in past history, this has marked Islam from the beginning, that it's a religion characterized by violence, by bloodshed, by warfare. And it's interesting how marked the contrast is between it and Christianity. In fact, this contrast is so marked that there's an atheist, or at least he was an atheist for much of his life, Anthony Flew. He wrote an article years ago in an atheist periodical called Free Inquiry magazine. And they were usually writing against Christianity, but this issue was done shortly after 9/11, so they decided to take a little detour and talk about Islam. And there's a article there, as I said, by Anthony Flew, who is no friend of Christianity, an enemy of Christianity. He said that whereas Christianity, in the first 3 centuries of its remarkable expansion, so he's noting that it's remarkable, it spread remarkably from Jerusalem into the rest of the world. He says, whereas Christianity in the first 300 years of its remarkable expansion gained all of its converts through peaceful persuasion, Islam, already in the latter years of Muhammad's life, was gaining most of its converts by means of the sword. And
Mm.
so here, Anthony Flew, again, no friend of Christianity, is saying this is what was true of Christianity, and this is what's always been true of Islam. And I think that just looking at those two things give people an insight into the nature of Christianity, the nature of Islam, and it should, to any moral person, give them an indication not only of the difference between the two, but which one is credibly, from God. At least just looking at these two issues.
Amen.
And another thing, though, I would say about this is, sometimes Muslims try to defend the violence that has been perpetrated by other Muslims by saying that's just a small fraction of the number of Muslims. Not all Muslims do this. And I quite agree, not all Muslims have been engaged in acts of terror. But at the same time, it's fallacious to say that Islam is not a religion of terror, because think about Christianity. Not all Christians are missionaries, right? The vast majority of Christians are not active missionaries out on the field in other lands and so forth. But
True.
isn't Christianity an evangelistic or missionary religion? Absolutely. Even if you're not out on the mission field in another country, you are supporting those who are. You're
Sure.
praying for them. You're pouring into those ministries financially in one way or another, either as an individual or through your church, because your church is supporting mission work, right? So Christianity is a missionary-oriented religion. We want to spread the name and fame of Christ throughout the world. So do Muslims. Not all Muslims are engaged in physical warfare, but all Muslims, if they're being true to the Quran, believe this is legitimately what they're supposed to be doing. And so that's why you see other Muslims, when there's an act of terror, often, even if they're not the ones who did it, they're celebrating in the streets because they're for this sort of thing. So I'm happy for this occasion to talk about this. I hope people will pay attention and help to push back the lies. The longer this lie is allowed to be maintained by people and even spread, the more trouble will come in its wake. We're only bringing a rope to our own hanging when we pave the way for Islam to run roughshod over other countries and then eventually ours. So I think people need to take serious attention to all of this. As for me, people can look me up on YouTube. I'm available there. I have a YouTube page under my name, Anthony Rogers. I usually look at doctrinal issues. Uh, that's usually my focus. I look at the defense of Christianity in the face of Islamic attacks against it. And then I look at Islamic doctrines and refute those. And then I go through the Bible and so forth. But I also do debates, a lot of debates. I've debated foremost Islamic apologists like Shabir Ali and others. So if they're interested in any of those sorts of things, they can check those out on my channel.
Well, Anthony, man, I got to tell you, it has been a blessing, deeply enriching. and very, very encouraging, the things that you said. I think I wish you guys, I do have to say this, I wish you guys could have been privy to the offline conversation that I had with Anthony. It's just awesome when you get to talk to a brother that just has the same heart. And he's just a smart man. And I would very much encourage you to go to his YouTube channel. It's Anthony Rogers. It's a great channel. I think you guys would really benefit from it. Watch a lot of the stuff that he's got up there. He's growing pretty rapidly, and that's a good thing, by the way. So I would encourage you guys to do that. Anyway, love you guys. Keep fighting the good fight. And this won't be the last time you hear from Anthony. All right. Love you guys. God bless you.